Hi everyone, it's Ren here, going crazy with the frequency of video releases at the moment, but you know, I always like to say strike while the iron is hot, and since I know that I can sometimes get a bit lazy and sort of engrossed in other activities, I just know that I ought to take advantage of my current flurry of inspiration. There's no doubt it has to be linked with the fact I have been working on a book on the INFJ type, which will be coming out soon. So that obviously has activated a lot of diodes in my brain, and I want to share. So still as part of the same series that I've been looking at over the last few days, the type functionalism series, if you like, where I clarify functions from what I call the type functionalist model, which is kind of my adopted model, not developed in as formalistic a manner as models by C.S. Joseph or Dave Superpowers or Auburn from Cognitive Type or any other such model, but nevertheless a work in progress that I'm using in my own investigations. So still in that spirit, and a few days ago we looked at the perceiving functions and how they are categorized in that functionalist model according to the processing and the perceiving tasks. So processing tasks are tasks of the introverted perception functions, whereas gathering tasks are tasks of the extroverted perception functions, knowing that the tasks always are related to the handling of information. This is really a way in which you can kind of make more rigorous and logical the manner in which an individual relates to the world by use of the functions. So you kind of reduce the world to information in a sense, massive amount of information, and the different functions are, as the name indicates functions, tasks to handle that information in a certain way. Extrovert perception, NE and SE, gathers information in the outside world. Introvert perception, NI and SI, process that information in order to kick it into shape to make it available and meaningful enough to be taken care of by the judging functions. Internal judgment, FI and SI, which I call deliberative judgment, was the topic of yesterday's video, and today I want to talk about external extroverted judgments, which is the domain of FE and TE, so extrovert feeling and extroverted thinking. Functions that are what I call the justificatory functions, the functions that justify, as opposed to the functions that deliberate. Now, I also call those the last link in the chain of cognition in a logical sense, whereas the gathering functions of extroverted perception are the first link in the chain. You always have to begin by grabbing hold of some information, and you finish by acting on the basis of that information which you've grabbed hold of, processed, deliberated against your network of beliefs to fit it into your internal framework, and then you act. And external judgment is a form of action. Now, it's not necessarily action in the sense that some people understand in the ordinary sense, like, going for a walk or deciding to watch TV. I mean, more in terms of cognition, action or orientation to the external world by means of judgment is, in a sense, it's not so much the action itself as the last condition to fulfill before action can be carried out. Action being not in itself a cognitive dimension of the individual. Action is more a matter of sometimes what we call the will. And the intersection between the will and the cognitive is something that Carl Jung was very interested in this concept of the creative fantasy. If you're familiar with that, he talks about creative fantasy and psychological types. I know a viewer is currently reading Psychological Types, so they will be familiar. I think this is Marie. They will be familiar with this concept of creative fantasy, not so much explored in current models of typology, but that's just a little bit of an aside. So extroverted judgments the last link in the chain of cognition prior to action. After all, we have to act in the world if we are to survive. We survive by doing certain things, and we do things on the basis of information which we've gathered, processed, deliberated against our beliefs, and justified. Justification is a matter of engaging with the external world when you have at your disposal information which you've already in a sense made your own, because it has gone through your subjective apparatus, the apparatus of your ego, the apparatus of your subjectivity. That's the domain of the introverted functions. So that's, again, either NI or SI on the perception side, and on the logically posterior judgment side, that's TI or FI. So I discussed these concepts and the associated functions in the videos I released in the last few days. So if you've not watched those videos, I encourage you to go back to them, because you'll understand a bit better what I'm going to talk about here by zeroing in on the extroverted judging functions. So FENT, justifying functions. So why is it accurate to call them justificatory functions, the functions that are in charge, that are tasked with the justification of information? Well, first of all, when you're in the realm of perception, there's nothing to be justified, because you're really still at the stage where you're trying to make the information intelligible to you. You're trying to make it intelligible so that it gets to a point where you can then make a judgment. Once you've made an internal judgment, you sort of check against your web of beliefs, according to whether you're an FI or TI user. Authenticity prioritized for FI, coherence prioritized for TI. Once you have sort of checked that, and your internal ecosystem has said, okay, validated, I have managed to fit the information within my web of beliefs, my judgment is not contradictory to my web of beliefs, so I've been able to make good use of the information that I've gathered. You're at a point where you've invested a lot of your subjectivity in the information. The information is no longer this kind of sprawling mass, either like, big static blocks like in the SE fashion, or just like more like an ocean with waves of different heights, like in an any fashion. The information at that point is no longer in this kind of chaotic, unrefined state. It has been judged by yourself already, introvertedly, by your internal judging functions. So you have a stake. Something's at stake here. You're not at a point where you can just look at the information in a disinterested fashion. You've already kind of involved yourself in it by the very process of engaging your ego introverted functions in it. Since that is the case, and since this information ultimately is going to lead to some kind of action, at least in potential, because it can still be rejected, what is the last thing you have to do? Well, the last thing you have to do is really to ensure not that it fits with your web of beliefs, because you've already done that, and that's fine, it worked, so you're at the last stage of cognition. Now is the time to see whether the information that in a sense you've created out of raw material can still fit with the external world. If it fits with the external world, it can then form the basis on which you will act in the world and change the world. The world will not be the same materially, literally, in terms of space-time dimensions, once you have moved to, act on the basis of your reasoning. So you're changing the world. Now, John Searle, the philosopher, has a very interesting distinction between, what he calls the direction of fit. There's the world to mind direction of fit, and then there's the mind to world direction of fit. I will not go into the detail of this, but extroverted judgment really has a mind to world direction of fit, which means that you have a content in your mind which you have refined, you've worked on it. It needs to fit the reality of the world. It will change the world, if it turns out to fit it, but it has to respect the kind of transcendent logic that the world possesses. So, in other words, it can't be something that the world rejects as nonsensical or contradictory. And this is where the external world is going to tell you whether you can justify the position that you've reached in your introverted judgment externally. And this is where the distinction between two approaches to this justification stands out. Because T and FE really don't go about justifying, checking against the external order of the world in the same way. In the book, I propose something which I think is potentially an original contribution to the field of typology. At least it's something that I think Jung looked over. So far, I've never encountered in any Jung literature this distinction. Of course, there's a distinction in Jung between FE and TE, but the problem is that he calls these functions of extroverted objective judgment. And it's true, isn't it? Most of the time, we following Jung and followers of Jung, we tend to think of or use the words introverted and subjective interchangeably. So we sometimes talk about FI as an introverted function, sometimes we talk about it as a subjective function. When we talk about FE, we talk about either an extroverted function or an objective function, and same for TE, and so on. And this is where I think that we're lacking. If you want to properly understand the distinction between FE and TE and how it's manifested in, on the one hand, TE users and ENTJs, ISTJs, INTJs, and so on, and on the other hand, FE users, ENFJs, ESFJs, but also ENTPs, INTPs, INFJs, and so on. My claim, and again, I explore this further in the book, so if you're interested in this topic, do keep your eyes peeled for the release of the book. I draw the distinction between objective judgment, which is properly the domain of extroverted thinking. I think TE, you can reasonably call it an objective judging function. So in the sense, the synonymy between extroverted and objective in the case of TE, I think works fine. I prefer to still use these words as having different meanings, but it works fine. You can say TE is objective. The reason why TE is really objective is that what T needs to justify the information is to literally look at the world of objects, to look at how objects in the world relate to each other, how they form a system, and whether the judgment that has been arrived at, in this case by FI, because it is always FI that works with TE, whether it actually fits with the external order of the world of objects. It's a world of objects, which is why the TE user is relatively independent when it comes to checking that information. They can access that information in a more or less impartial way, either by direct observation, empirical observation, by referring to objective, indirectly to objective information in papers, scientific papers, or papers of all sorts. And in that case, they can check that there is a fit and then confirm that they can act on the basis of their extroverted, in this case, objective judgment, because they check the internal order of their judgment, which is actually linked to authenticity, to the external order of the world of objects. This is not how FE works, and I think any FE user, I think on this channel, most of such users will be INFJs. I think that it's pretty clear that no INFJ or no FE user, for that matter, works like this. The fit against the external order of the world, of course, takes place, because that's in the nature of the last link in the chain, extroverted judgments. But it's not a check for fit against the world of objects. It's actually a check for fit against the world of subjects. And that's very, very different. Because what is a subject? It's essentially a person. FE is directed toward people. It's not directed toward objects like TE is. So that's why calling it an objective function, like Jung himself does, is misleading. It's misleading because it's only objective in a negative sense. It's subjective in the sense that it is not subjective like the introverted functions are, but it's actually intersubjective. The best definition of FE is not as an objective function, certainly not as a subjective function, but as an intersubjective function. And the intersubjective world is a kind of objective world, but really not in the sense that it is a world of objects, only in the sense that it is out there. It's in the world of people. It's beyond your individual psyche. But FE encounters people. It is people that FE needs to confirm information with, and this is why FE users always come across as needing to be validated in their opinions by other people. You've noticed that, right? I often hear, insecure FE users as being spotted apparently by the fact that in order to reach any kind of decision in their life, they need to ask a lot of people, and they need the tribe to say, yeah, okay, you can do this. Now, this is true at one level, but I think that let me humbly say, at the deeper level of the type functionalism model, this is because the external world that FE is dealing with to justify the conclusions arrived at by TI is not a world of objects. It's not the objective world of extroverted thinking. It is the world of subjects, other subjects, the intersubjective world. You can also call it, quite simply, the social world. FE is projected toward not the world of objects, which is essentially the world of physics, the objective, fundamentally quintessential objective worlds that the INTJ love so much, but the world of the social, the world of other people. And other people have opinions, other people have egos, other people have moods, other people have, weaknesses. They're maybe more open to persuasion, they're more open to being influenced by charisma, they're more open to being manipulated to an extent. So here the manipulative possibilities of FE are clear. They're self-defeating in a way, because what you want is confirmation by the external social world that your internal judgment is really valid. Not that it is considered valid by people because they've been seduced by your language. If you do that and you act on that basis, you might be launching into an action on the basis of a false conclusion, which people have agreed with because you played with them a little bit with FE. So there's always a danger with the use of FE in this way, but there's also incredible potential in terms of world changing, in terms of world reformation, because if you have a very, very strong conclusion, a very, very strong discovery that you made internally, FE has the power, if you're extremely charismatic, extremely ambitious, and you're extremely lucky, to convince the whole world. And this is the way in which you can have, a Jesus Christ. This is the way in which you can have Nelson Mandela, but this is also the way in which you can have a Hitler. This is also the way in which you can have a Trotsky. So, massive advantages, but also massive disadvantages and risks. That, to some extent, insofar as the social world is concerned, is not present in the case of the INTJ, for example. But you can easily picture an INFJ with a very strong visionary tendency, who's able to gather information and process it with NI that is able to pick up patterns that are not easily seen by others. If the INFJ is relatively confident and has well-developed TI, they'll be able to check for the coherence with their beliefs and make the preliminary subjective conclusion available to FE. If their FE is powerful, they can be really influential. Now, it's true that ENFJs will tend to be more influential because they're extroverted, and so they're projected toward other people a lot more naturally than INFJs are, and INFJs often tend to keep to themselves, which can lead to a different way of projecting the FE function, a fascinating way, which I call the universal way. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video, or else you'll have to read the book. In the meantime, I hope this was enjoyable, and let me know in the comments what you thought. See you guys, bye bye.